Well, hello again. I'm very happy to be here for the third day running. I hope you're as happy as I am. I've had a very special time. I've discovered a new city and a new country. This is my first time here. And apart from thanking again Yohal, Ian Angus, Clint Burnham, Samir Gandesha, I'd like to thank very specially Hilda Fernandez, not only for a very important moment for me personally. It's always great to gather perspective with critical distance of one's own doings and thoughts. But I'm especially grateful for her having opened a space of interrogation, of dialogue, of confrontation, of questioning between psychoanalytic questions, ideas happening, in my case, in Spanish, with a peculiar history which has to do with Latin American Lacanism, and the putting in relation of that, first of all, in her own case, it so happens on this occasion also on mine, with your local perspectives and psychoanalysis happening in English. This is not simply a matter of, two different countries. It's a whole different set of universes if we take into account the specificity that links psychoanalysis with language, and therefore psychoanalysis in Spanish and psychoanalysis in English are actually quite different things, at least to start out with. And I think she gives us a very important opportunity in having occasion to put these two together and try to make something out of them, not only during the talks but afterwards in the contexts that start happening on a personal level. And if we see this in wider perspective, I think the exercise is essential insofar as it's quite clear that the destinies of psychoanalysis are linked to the destinies of psychoanalysis in English for many reasons. And also, I think, in a growing sense, they are linked to what happens with the growing presence of I was going to say psychoanalysis, but I meant to say Spanish in North America. There's a curious phenomenon by which the so-called Hispanicization of the northern region of America is accompanied by a growing presence of Lacanism, since Lacanianism has been an important presence amongst us in the Spanish-speaking sections of this continent. So I think as a gift, she opens up a horizon which is very, very important, and which, of course, goes much beyond my own possibilities of inviting you to have that dialogue. I think it's an effort in translation and in comparative perspectives that needs to be cultivated more and more. And I just wanted to mention this in order to try and make us a bit more aware of this and of the transcendence that such occasions, such initial occasions perhaps have to enhance the channels by which we could perhaps do more of this. So for all those reasons, a very big thank you to Hilda, and for these wonderful days and this widening horizon that I'm left with on account of them. Thank you for being here yourselves. And I try to both wrap up certain aspects of what I've been talking about and also make an intervention which allows us to talk about certain particular issues relating to the contacts and differences, the contrast between psychoanalysis and therapy, even if you don't have the context of the last two talks. Okay, I'm going to run very briefly through some of the material that I've been through as a reminder and as an introduction in the case of those amongst you who haven't been in the last two talks. I'm talking about Lacan's theory of the four discourses. These discourses are notations of social bonds. The basic point is that each of these four discourses corresponds to a type of social link. The discourse of the master would correspond basically to those links associated with the religious and the political in general, which are, in this sense, indistinguishable from a psychoanalytic point of view, which is quite a provocative statement. The discourse of the university would be associated with science and those knowledge-based bonds. The discourse of the hysteric would correspond in the same way to art, the aesthetic sphere, and the discourse of the analyst would therefore describe psychoanalysis not simply as a so-called therapeutic exercise, but as a social bond all of its own, which is, again, an interesting and I think quite provocative and refreshing perspective if we've been thinking about psychoanalysis as a sort of caring for the other type of practice. These four discourses name matrices that give forth to possibilities relating to institutional practice, discursive formations, of course, interactions, forms of constructing subjectivity both at an individual and at a social level. In fact, there's nothing more individual than social about these discourses or social bonds. A social bond is inherently something social, but it's also something individual at the same time. Just as language, it would be impossible to think of language either as only social or as only individual, and the same could be said. Now, the derivation of this is that, in fact, an analytic intervention, a psychoanalytic intervention, is therefore not simply individual, even if we're treating or working with a single person. There's always a social dimension associated, and this opens up a whole lot of questions that we might go into a bit later on. Religion or politics, science, art, and psychoanalysis are therefore not simply the names of the fields of activity or the institutions associated with these discourses, but they're actually names that refer to fields, wide fields of interaction and of social construction in human affairs. The other of discursivity, what is outside these four discourses, is psychosis. And what makes this outside is the lack of this moment of negativity that I'm... Oh, could we have the projector on, please? So you've been imagining these four discourses. I suppose you could come up and draw them and see if what you've been visualizing is the same or not.
We're just going to have to turn off the microphone for a second.
No problem. They're going to have to turn off the mic for a moment so you can have the pleasure of having the images. So see you in a bit. So they look exactly what you imagined like, yeah? My talk started with this, so I'll start all over again, right? Okay, so the discourse of the master, the hysteric, the university, and the analyst. I won't go into the further detail how they operate. Perhaps we can describe the details further in the case of the very specific questions that we're trying to get at this evening, to do with the proposition that in fact psychoanalytic discourse is distinct from therapeutic discourse, which is the main thrust of what I'm trying to get at. A year after introducing these four original discourses, Lacan proposes a fifth discourse called the Discourse of the Capitalist. The question is interesting because one could have well asked where capitalism fit in the previous scheme, if it fitted in at all. In other words, to put it simply, is capitalism a religion? Is it a political form? Is it a form of organization of knowledge? Is it a type of scientific sort of arrangement of sorts? Is it an aesthetic exercise, or is it, in a sense, a type of analytic bond? And the introduction of this fifth discourse, of course, suggests that it's neither of the above. And Lacan will introduce this fifth discourse as a mutation of the discourse of the master, and therefore will suggest in some sense that we are confronted with capitalism with a new matrix altogether that would perhaps give forth to new formations in epistemic terms, in aesthetic terms, in subjective terms, which is of course a theme particularly important for us clinically here, and perhaps also to mutations in psychoanalysis as such. Now, I won't go into much detail on this, but the four discourses have very precise rules of constitution originally, so that in a sense, religion, politics, science, art, and psychoanalysis in the classical, canonical sense are variations of each other. They are rearrangements of the same elements that are at work in all the other discourses, namely two kinds of... Do you see this arrow here, the cursor? Yeah, let me see if I can... Well, never mind. Basically, the stuff of social bonding would be made up of two types of signifiers S1 and signifiers S2. The relation between the two can be thought of as the difference between a frame and a work framed by the frame. So the frame would correspond to S1. They would be inaugural signifiers, while S2 would be the actual contents opened up by an original framing. You can think of book titles and then the contents of the book and so on and so forth. You need at least two signifiers in order for any single signifier to make sense. So you need these two signifiers. Whoops. And then, of course, there's the subject of the unconscious, which is what we're talking about when we talk about psychoanalysis. The subject is represented by a signifier under the form of a name, for example, a proper name. A proper name represents the subject with respect to other signifiers in general. So here we would have, in condensed form, the definition, the Lacanian understanding of the relation between signifiers and subjectivity. Signifiers would be always mediations, not between subjects, but between subjects and other signifiers, subjects that are themselves represented by a signifier. So that social life, as such, would be a relation between representatives of subjectivity and not between subjects themselves. Yeah. So sociality would be the dynamic of an interplay of forms of signification, traces that are in particular relation with other traces, and these traces have effects on subjects retroactively. Yeah, so that it's not the same to be called something, so-and-so John, if you have three other brothers called John, or if your father is called John, or if your father's worst enemy was called John. The effect that a proper name has on subjectivity is, of course, relative to the position that signifier occupies in relation to other signifiers. So the interplay would be between signifiers. So this is the subject, these are the signifiers, and this little a is a remainder, some extra something which is not able to be assimilated either by signifiers or by the subject, a sort of extraneous substance called jouissance, sometimes translated very clumsily as enjoyment in English. You might come across this. But in any case, it's a remainder made up of something which cannot be turned back into signifying matter, and it cannot either be entirely assimilated by subjectivity as such. And this, of course, is a way of talking about the unconscious, which is both foreign to our own selves and foreign to language, insofar as language or discursivity would be that which would attempt to articulate the unconscious. So you might have heard the formula, the unconscious is structured in the form of a language, which is a sort of a move to make the unconscious prone to a kind of analytic approach, insofar it would be legible, symbolically prone to legibility. But of course, the heart of the matter, the deepest, most fundamental portions of the unconscious would be inaccessible to signifiers as such, and that's, the ultimate power and the ultimate importance about the unconscious. So in each of these four, you have different positionings of this extraneous, very peculiar substance, which has been described as something different from the Descartian res cogitans and the res extensa. So it wouldn't be a matter of either of these substances identified in philosophy. It would be a third sort of substance which would not be, as I said, assimilable to either of these. I will go straight to the discourse of the analyst. Here, this substance is directed, vectorized towards the subject, so that the subject is confronted by this unspeakable, undescribable, unassimilable thing. And the work of analysis would be what one does with this substance, which are suffering, the original reason why one might want to go to an analyst in the first place, the suffering indicates that this substance is somehow in excess of our possibility of putting some kind of limit to it, or putting it in some kind of proper place, if such a thing is possible. And the whole point of an analytic exercise, and we'll go into further detail, I won't remain at this sort of very general, at the level of this very general description. The whole point would be how one produces this. S1 is a point of production. Oh dear. These four positions have functions. You have an agent that is put in relation with an other, is in relation with another, for a reason, for a cause, called the place of truth, and produces an effect. So you basically have here the description of how the production of a signifier of a first order, which I described in terms of a proper name, is what is to be produced in the process of an analysis. A name which can have the characteristics of sort of stretching enough, far enough, and in a manner appropriate enough for this unmanageable substance to run along certain channels which might be more favorable to your existence and to the history that is constitutive of yourself, your personal history and the legacy that you've been handed, the hand that life has dealt you with all the circumstances that we know life is made up of. So, very schematically, an analysis might be described as parting from an insatisfaction with one's own name, the way that one is represented to others, and how others and how life sort of situates us on account of the signifier that we go around with, representing ourselves with, and working, in a way, sculpting, modifying that signifier into some new signifying form, which is more effective and which allows us to circulate and live in a way more satisfactory to ourselves, and that might transform, jouissance lived as suffering into jouissance as under the form of pleasure, the form of meaning and the form of satisfaction, at least to a certain degree. At least a greater degree of satisfaction than was previously the case. Okay, so these are the four. Lacan then introduces a fifth discourse, and since he breaks the rules of constitution of these four, which basically respond to the law of what he called commutability, meaning that these four letters, as he called them, S1, S2, the subject, and A, basically go round the clock, occupying each of these four positions in the same order. So S1 starts in the position of the agent, goes to the place of the other, goes to the place of truth or the place of production. You can arrange them, of course, in different ways. But the point is that they go round clockwise. I describe this functioning as a sort of a clockwork. And, it's very elegant theoretical formulations in the sense of mathematicians talking about elegant solutions and such like. But when the fifth discourse is introduced, these initial letters are inverted. So the rule of commutability, the law of commutability is violated. And that, of course, opens a Pandora's box, which I have ventured out to open, which produces this. In other words, the question about whether there might not be simply 4, but as many as 24 possible social bonds. This is a fundamental question for our time because it's a question about how many ways of organizing and inhabiting social bonds we might have, how many possible forms for the state, how many possible institutional forms, how might we live family lives in different ways. Parental roles have changed very radically for both technological, scientific, social reasons. Same-sex partners, the question about whether or not they can or they should be allowed in terms of judicial discussions and so on, to adopt kids, to have kids. These are, of course, things that you're familiar with. But we are faced in our time very clearly by questions to do with how many forms of family life might there be, and so on and so forth in relation to each of the main kinds of social institutions that we live by. So I won't insist too much on the 24. It will take us a bit longer. So basically I want to work with not simply 10, the ones that I have here, but we're going to zoom in into 2 particular ones, the discourse of the analyst and a discourse I have called the discourse of the therapist. This is an introduction so that you get a sense of how I actually got to writing this so-called discourse of the therapist. What have I done here? You have these original 4 discourses that I've described in general terms, and then I have mapped out what versions corresponding to the discourse of the capitalist you might have deriving from each of these 3 remaining discourses. So you have here, let us say, a capitalist variant of the discourse of the university, a capitalist version of the discourse of the hysteric, and a capitalist version of the discourse of the analyst. The question is, are these expressions of contemporary forms of organizing not only the law, but also knowledge, and also subjectivity, and also the way of dealing with subjective malaise. And this, of course, has to do with our main concern tonight, psychoanalysis in relation to what I'm trying to characterize as therapy. You'll have to trust me on this, and my basic response is yes, there are mutations of these domains brought about by this fundamental mutation in the judicial and the religious. And these discourses, at least to my mind, are able to express or to capture something of the mutations that affect, for example, the traditional university, insofar as it's become a technological institute. So that technology is distinct from knowledge in its more traditional forms. the engineering, the knowledge associated with engineering, as opposed to, say, classical philosophy or even theology, has an altogether different constitution. And that would be expressed by the discourse of information, which is a name I have proposed. So this would even go as far as describing digitalized knowledge, which would be a knowledge denarrativized and discretized, organized in like tiny bits and bytes. You have also this discourse of the miserable, which would be an expression of contemporary subjectivity, which I think we can see, and clinically we observe, for example, under the form of chronic depression, how subjectivity can be sort of beyond itself. We might face subjective, sort of quite extreme subjective forms which are not psychotic and which, however, talk of a condition in which the subject is somehow deprived of their own selves. And that would correspond to this discourse of the miserable. Now, we get finally to the discourse of the analyst in contrast with the discourse of the therapist. And you will see that these two are actually similar. They are identical rather on the right-hand side, but they are different on the left-hand side. So that here the agent is this residue, and in the case of the discourse of the therapist, the agent is knowledge. In the case of the discourse of the analyst, knowledge is eclipsed, put to the side. The analyst does not present him or herself as someone who knows, does not present himself during the session as an expert, someone who has answers, but rather as someone who puts questions, who's, let us say, ignorant, but of course ignorant in a Socratic sense, not straight ignorant or crude ignorant, but ignorant methodologically ignorant, if you want, informedly ignorant. In contrast, at least from the perspective that I work from, what would be characteristic of the discourse of the therapist would be that the therapist operates on the basis of a particular kind of knowledge as an expert in this or that or in such and such a method, and therefore has one way or another a whole set of answers in order to sort of provide the ailing subject with a repertoire of routes to feeling better, becoming a better partner, father, whatever. And the therapist would therefore put under the carpet the residual. So the therapist in this description feigns to know and forgets knowing Socratically that it's impossible to know, particularly impossible to know the unconscious insofar as, and here a reminder, the unconscious would be that which has a sort of living core, a malted core of impossible, a substance impossible to turn into signification. That would be a sort of a mysterious, rather bogus type thing from a therapeutic perspective. the therapist wants to know and wants to be able to provide answers to a subject that is inhabited radically by questions of different kinds. Now, the fact that the right-hand side is the same doesn't mean that the effect is the same on both counts. I've already described how the analytic bond is oriented to the production of something like a proper name, a signifier of the first kind. And in the case of therapy, a signifier would be produced, but it would be an identitarian type signifier. One might synthesize this idea I'm trying to get at, referring to the figure of a label. So a therapeutic process in this sense would produce an effect of labeling, would produce an effect of identifying with the, for example, medical label which is used to describe some condition. So that, and this is often the case with patients, you have patients who've been to see people and they are very proud to say they are subject to such and such a condition, bipolar or whatever, and they identify with the label and they represent themselves to the other on the basis of this labeling. And this fits in quite simply and directly with this description that I'm trying to make of the discourse of the therapist. Now, I've got like 3 basic propositions that I want to put to you, and I'm going to mention already that the central text that I'm interested in working with it a bit, I will only have time to make a few indications, are the recommendations for physicians on the psychoanalytic method of treatment, which is a text by Freud, 1912, which is a very beautiful, very straightforward, and very profound, as we will see, indication of how it is that the analyst must listen if they or we will behave as an analyst during the session. So basically I'm going to invite you to reread this text in your own time after I've tried to provide a context from where to read this or reread it, and then add the provocative question about whether psychoanalysis is a form of clinical work, and I'm going to say it is not. And then finally I'm going to ask whether we might conceive of analytic practice as something which can go beyond the analytic office, beyond the consulting rooms, and therefore beyond the spatial contexts that are usually associated with so-called clinical work, of which psychoanalysis would not be an instance. Now, just to make sure I'm not sort of bungling forward with incomprehensible abstractions and such like, I'd just like to invite you to make questions or ask after certain particular points to do with this general setup. So it's an opportunity to clarify any aspect that might have still be pending after my first 2 talks, and if you're coming into contact with this material for the first time, you can also just ask some general points of clarification.
That's the question about what you pointed out, the difference between the analyst and the therapist. So my listening, my sense is what you're saying is the
therapist would be just reinforcing false self versus true self in terms of the label and any kind of activity that would be supporting any development that isn't rooted in the true self would be more destructive than helpful ultimately. I don't know if that's jumping in a direction that's not what you're saying.
It sounds right. I would have questions about being too confident about distinguishing between true and false as concerns selfhood. This reminds me of a question which is an interesting question. What happens if a patient lies his way through an analytic session? Is lying an obstacle for psychoanalysis? And of course it's not particularly conducive for an analysis, but in fact lying would be just as patterned by the unconscious as so-called truthful talk. And of course we know that purely truthful talk is actually impossible. We lie, first of all, to ourselves. Our memory plays tricks on ourselves. So that I think that final distinction from the point of view of the unconscious between lies and the truth would apply to false and true or authentic self. But yes, I think the general idea would be that. Yep.
Thank you. I just want to ask if you would clarify. You are speaking from a frame of reference here that I think it's important that we understand, or that I'm trying to make sure I understand. You're saying everything you're saying is really from a Lacanian point of view. In other words, you're not talking about an analysis or an analyst who might be using drive theory, ego psychology, object relations theory, which are different theories and ways of looking at that interaction entirely, potentially. Mm-hmm. Would you comment on that just in some small way?
It's actually a very useful question to me. I thank you for it. I was myself struck by, when I began thinking about what I would talk about this evening, when I went back to Freud's text, and I've worked quite a bit with his text, I was surprised by how Freudian my argument was. And this is something I'd like to stress as we go along, reading a few passages here and there, and you can then read more widely in your own time. My response, and in a way it would be a friendly, challenging response, would be, this is the Freudian position generally. And then we would need to work out the relation between all these different legacies in analysis and the original Freudian source, which of course is not one and single, insofar as what we have inevitably are various readings of Freud. So of course this would be a Lacanian reading of Freud, but I would want to shift the emphasis and say, no, it's not Lacan, it's Freud. And then we would need to take in your question and talk much more at length about the relation between all these different forms of reading Freud and building on the basis of Freud, or leaving Freud to the side in some cases, etc. So it's not actually an answer, but rather a replaying placing of your very question, but in relation to Freud this time rather than Lacan.
On Wednesday, we talked a bit about the relationship between the discourses themselves. Not a lot from what I remember, mostly just the signifiers within each discourse. I was wondering if we could create a relationship between the discourses in the same way. Like, so if we have the master in one quadrant, the top left, the university in the right, and then the hysteric in the bottom left, and the analyst in the right, and that would be master's relationship to the other three. And do you see what I'm getting at here?
You mean the reordering of the sequence, diagram, etc., and the consequences that might have?
Yeah, like the master pushes over to the university, and underneath the university is the analyst that pushes up to the master. Yeah.
I mean, I think if you see this diagram, it's quite clear that you could reorganize the whole set in many, many different ways and create interesting ways of getting from one to the other. However, the order is not arbitrary insofar as the starting point is always a discourse of the master. It's the sort of point of departure, the matrix of discursivity as such, and the order would be given essentially by this sequencing of how the letters go round the clock in the first instance. So I've derived, in the case of the order I set out from, what these derived discursive instances would be about in terms of the capitalist sort of quartet. So I'm both open to your suggestion in terms of playing with the various ways of ordering the discourses, and at the same time I'm stressing the reason why this order is in fact quite specifically what it is on the basis of what I've already explained, and the starting point with the discourse of the master. Yeah.
I was wondering if the analyst discourse also has a sort of topological relation to an analyst's room, and if that is the case, how would the analyst relate themselves according to the analyst discourse and with the position of the big other, etc.?
That's interesting. We could explore it more, but I immediately thought of the fact that an analysis can be equally practiced with or without the analysand being on the couch. So that in fact I would stress the immaterial character of discursivity. I would say even transmaterial character of discursivity. And I would say, in order to anticipate some of the thoughts that one might have about psychoanalysis beyond the clinical traditional setting, that insofar as it's a discursive practice and a discursive bond, in fact, the forms it can take are, in principle, impossible to anticipate. And I would want to include the spatial considerations as well. So I would want to get away from any, and I'll use a strong word, fetishization of analytic space and the fixedness of analytic space, and privilege the mobility that discursivity can provide. Yeah? Who else? Yes?
Hi. Just in regards to...
I think it's off.
Oh, no, just not talking into it. Just regards to when Lacan says what is outside the four discourses, it's in psychosis. How does that relate to your new set of discourses? And the way the discourse works in the capitalist is it functions differently, if I'm correct. And then why do your other discourses function as the first discourses?
Right. Okay, they would... The four contemporary capitalist discourses would be social bonds, instances of discursivity, and therefore they would be before or beyond psychosis. Psychosis would be the lack of social bond. I stressed how it's possible to be in language but outside of discourse. Deliria can take the form of linguistic, even quite wonderful constructions, but they don't bond one to other subjects, or those signifiers do not represent subjectivity to other signifiers in a way which allows bonding. How are these related to the original quartet? The capitalist four are derived. I've operated the same mutation as Lacan proposed in the case of the Discourse of the Capitalist. The inversion of these two letters, the left-hand side letters, are inverted, and I've inverted them in each case. So these are definitely, let us say, members of a quartet which is constituted with the same rules, and that's why I consider that they are derivations of these first four. Okay, I see that there are no completely perplexed questions, and I thank you for that. I'm happy. There are questions to do with the limits of various positions and descriptions I've made. So I'm going to press on and try to deliver the goods as promised for this lecture. Is psychoanalysis clinical? We talk so much about clinical practice, right? Analysts take pride in being clinicians as opposed to academics, dealing with, real life situations, sort of thing. That's fine. It's also problematic in certain ways, I find, insofar as it tends to disregard the great value that theory, for example, can have in orienting a practice. But I am referring you to a very precious, I find, text by the French analyst Guy Legoffet. It's in my bibliography, and I'm sorry because I couldn't direct you when I sent my bibliography to the actual text on the internet. You actually can find that text in full on the internet for free if you look for Guy Legoffet's personal website. It takes a tiny bit of time. It's not on the first positions when you search for it with Google, but you can get to it in the end, and it's well worth reading. You will find that Guy Legoffet basically stresses what we already know. In other words, that the clinical gaze, it's a gaze based on previous knowledge. which is sort of obvious, right? If you're going to practice clinical interventions, if you're going to diagnose, if you're going to prescribe remedies, you need to, as one says, know what you're talking about, right? If not, you're a quack, and therefore a false clinician. Which is fine in terms of one's professional, one's exigency that professional clinicians should be professional. And I don't imagine that anyone here disagrees with that. But the whole problem is that we're talking here about knowledge as a starting point. Knowledge which is absolutely fundamental if you're a medic, or if you venture out to be a therapist. I'm coming back to the discourses now. If you're a therapist, your starting point is knowledge. But if you're an analyst, knowledge has to be put in brackets, not because you don't know your stuff, but because you have to establish a relation with the stuff you know, which is, to put it in shorthand, Socratic. You don't approach the discourse of an analysand with a repertoire of answers, but rather, as I said, a repertoire of questions strategically put in order for the analysand to make his or her way through the discourse that emerges from their free associating. So the analyst has to be placed in a position which is, one could say, before knowledge. Not ignorant, but before knowledge, in that place which is a precondition for a production of signifiers, S1, that will be the basis of a knowledge whose author is the analysand himself or herself. So I like the figure, for example, of, mirrors require this so-called tain, the tain of the mirror, this sort of opaque background in order to reflect back. And that tain, which is opaque, which is the precondition for reflection, would, I think, correspond to this position that the analyst has to occupy, discursively speaking, in order for knowledge to take place on the side of the analysand. In other words, the problem with the therapist knowing or acting as if they know is that they are invading territory which, strictly speaking, analytically, corresponds only to the analysand. That is why the analyst who proposes answers on the basis of their own free associations or their own personal references are in fact momentarily taking the role of a patient. When an analyst answers instead of asking, momentarily they are taking the place of a patient. And they are inverting the sequence in which this social bond is organized in order for analytic practice to take place. So, however sophisticated this knowledge might be, and you will see in Le Goffet, as Hilda already anticipated, that he refers to Peirce and to the semiotic of interpretation. As you know, this is not mentioned in Le Goffet, but it's an interesting reference to take into account. Semiotics is also the science of symptoms, and therefore of reading and interpreting symptoms. This semiotic can be very, very subtle and sophisticated, and a good medic, a good interpreter of symptoms can do wonderful things on that basis. But a medic and a therapist are not an analyst. They occupy the place of the reflexive as such, and not of the tane, which is a precondition for reflexivity to take place. In other words, taking the stance of knowledge is a way of doing away with the unconscious. The unconscious is sort of pushed under the carpet in the case of therapeutic discourse, whereas in the discourse of the analyst, the unconscious is the agent. The enigma of the unconscious is the very agent of the mobilization that an analysis is, and therefore also of the mobilization of a production of knowledge. So what I'm trying to stress is that the analytic operation occupies, logically speaking, an a priori position with respect to the production of knowledge and the movement of various components that knowledge might be composed of. And this, of course, might be related to the necessary neutrality that an analyst keeps to, because in fact, the analytic function is not concerned with the actual content, the positive content of this or that knowledge or this or that kind of signifier, but simply with the production of signifiers as such. Of course, it's not that the analyst turns a blind eye to the actual content of those signifiers. This might be significant. But ultimately, and this is the example that Hilda brought in her introduction, the hermeneutic taking up of symbolism, for example, in Mexico in the metro you have these wonderful sellers that go around with books for dream interpretation that cost like 50 cents. So you can find out, you dreamt that, the sea came and engulfed the whole city, and you can look up page 78 and find out what this might mean in your life. That kind of one-to-one relation, or even a very sophisticated relation between certain images, certain symbolic contents, or certain images and their so-called meanings, that is all in the space of the reflexive. And that is situated in an interior in relation to which the analyst must occupy an exterior in order to, as I said, occupy the the place of the taint of the mirror and not of the reflection itself. I'd like to put this in relation to Freud, which is a reference which is very central here to all of us in one way or another. Which leads me to my second point about how an analyst listens. How is it we must listen if we are to be situated at the point where the taint of the mirror is to be found instead of the mirror as such? Freud, in his 1912 text, Recommendations for Physicians on the Psychoanalytic Method of Treatment, will refer to this famous evenly hovering attention that the analyst should keep to whilst listening. And I'll try and say two kinds of things. First, he will provide a description of what this evenly hovering attention is like and what it's about. And then one can ask the very simple question, well, how am I really to understand evenly hovering attention, and how can I be sure that I'm actually keeping to it in my practice? In other words, I think it's justified to, be more insistent and ask what the hell this sort of evenly hovering attention is about anyway. Basically, I'd like you to reread this text and note how, in fact, very, very rigorously, Freud is trying to distinguish between listening and understanding. So he says the analyst must not understand that which they listen to. Listening should be directed at something other than understanding, and I will try to ground this more clearly in a moment. He says, for as soon as attention is deliberately concentrated in a certain degree, one begins to select from the material before one. One point will be fixed in the mind with particular clearness, and some other consequently disregarded, and in this selection one's expectations or one's inclinations will be followed. This is just what must not be done. However, if one's expectations are followed in this selection, there is the danger of never finding anything but what is already known. It's like people doing field work and finding out the kinds of answers that are sort of suggested to those providing the answers. Sort of the loaded dice of research that finds exactly what is expected to be found on the basis of certain preconceptions that are sort of inherently present in the formulations that the research is based on in the first place. He goes about very carefully describing how, for example, even if one wants to publish a scientific study of a case, one must be very careful to distinguish the moment of research and the moment of practice in psychoanalysis. He says, for example, It is indeed one of the distinctions of psychoanalysis that research and treatment proceed hand in hand. So treatment is a type of research. But still, the technique required for the one begins at a certain point to diverge from that of the other. It is not a good thing to formulate a case scientifically while treatment is proceeding. To reconstruct its development, anticipate its progress, and take notes from time to time of the condition at the moment, as scientific interest would require. Cases which are thus destined at the start to scientific purposes and treated accordingly suffer in consequence. While the most successful cases are those in which one proceeds, as it were, aimlessly, and allows oneself to be overtaken by any surprises, always presenting to them an open mind, free from any expectations. To submit the material gained to the synthetic process, only after the analysis is concluded, is the right course for the analyst. I cannot recommend my colleagues emphatically enough to take as a model in psychoanalytic treatment the surgeon who puts aside all his own feelings, including that of human sympathy, and concentrates his mind on a single purpose, that of performing the operation as skillfully as possible. Under present conditions, the affective impulse of greatest danger to the psychoanalyst will be, and listen to this word, the therapeutic ambition to achieve by this novel and disputed method something which will impress and convince others, the patient perhaps in the first place. This will not only cause a state of mind unfavorable for the work in him personally, but he will find himself in consequence helpless against certain of the patient's resistances upon the struggle with which the cure primarily depends. The justification for this coldness of feeling in the analyst is that it is the condition which brings the greatest advantage to both persons involved, and so on and so forth. So it's actually very striking how clearly insistent he is on removing any of the usual strategies that we have in order to ascertain meaning, ascertain significance, ascertain focus in relation to any material. And here I want to immediately establish, I would say perhaps an analogy, I don't think it's simply an analogy, between listening and reading. And you'll see why in a little bit. Understanding, focusing, predicting, investigating in scientific manner, and therefore preempting the destinies of a particular treatment, instead of allowing treatments to surprise us in the very first place, to be absolutely singular and different from any other previous or future treatments. All of those operations are operations of knowledge. They are operations which imply modeling onto the discourse of an analysand a preconceived scheme, which is a piece of knowledge. It's a map. It's an epistemic map of whatever. One might say the Oedipus, or Lacan's convoluted theories, or the four discourses, or any of these prefabricated maps, fabrics of knowledge, are absolutely contrary to the operation of the analyst. And you will think this is sort of excessive on my part, but I'm surprised on rereading Freud's text how closely he's describing the need to distinguish absolutely between an operation of disengaged but very close attention to the discourse of an analysand, and on the other hand, a disposition which is immediately overdetermined by knowledge of one kind or another, even very fine knowledge, which would precipitate us towards the therapeutic mode. This is why I have the nerve of affirming that what I'm talking about here is not Lacan but Freud. And please reread this wonderful text and be kind and do so in the light of some of these arguments that I'm trying to put to you. But how are we really to understand this strange notion of evenly hovering attention? Is it possible to be attentive but in a way in which attention is directed to nothing in particular? I mean, doesn't that sound like some kind of Zen injunction of impossibility, like clapping with a single hand? I think there are many, many misunderstandings surrounding this Freudian description. How do you describe being attentive to nothing in particular? In fact, there's an aporia there, isn't there? How do you describe the very creation of a vacuum as regards meaning? It's a problem, isn't it? I mean, it's really a challenge. How might you name this? How might you write about it? So, my suggestion to put some more articulation into this rather enigmatic Freudian formula, even though one can follow, as I have insisted, how clearly he's differentiating analytic listening from therapeutic listening. He even uses a term in the English translation. I'd like to go to the German and see what the term is there. But I found it extremely useful to refer already some time ago to the elaborations of Paul de Man in relation precisely to reading. Here we have a phenomenal elaboration which basically explains in very detailed and concrete terms why there is an aporia, a sort of structural impossibility of understanding at the same time as one reads. At school we're taught to read in order to understand, right? And the more you read, the more you understand. Well, de Man explains very, very clearly why the more you read, the less you understand. And if you're understanding, that is because you're not reading, which is actually a very Freudian proposition. You're only finding what you already know. How would you understand things otherwise? If you're understanding, you're finding what you already know in the text. Whereas reading rigorously, in fact, has the very radical effect of loosening any meanings that have been attached traditionally to a text, and even end up by loosening the very meanings that you yourself might have found in a particular text. And when I say meanings, I say literally meanings. And you'll see that this is very, very practical. There's nothing magical or mystical about this. Language itself, text itself, would be modeled, would have the very structure of this mirror and this pane that I was talking about. So reading a text is like facing a mirror. You can narcissistically get lost in your own image and think you're understanding what it says. But if you read far enough, you get to the tane of the text and you'll stop understanding what this text actually says. And this is not a metaphor. I would, if you've never encountered Paul de Man before, I want to heartily invite you to read a very short and very accessible text called The Return to Philology, which is on my list. The Return to Philology describes something very wonderful, which is a reading workshop which took place at Harvard University in the 1950s, in which students were invited by quite a traditional professor, whose name I happen to remember, called Ruben Brouwer. I've never known anything else about Ruben Brouwer. Perhaps you literary types have. But this sort of very traditional literature professor invited his students to read and read carefully. And the point is that he insisted on them reading so carefully that they got to the point of discarding their very understandings of the text they were reading. Now, my enthusiasm is not simply due to the fact that this is a sort of a fascinating, sort of Harry Potter-esque scene where, you know, magic takes place in a flying classroom. But I taught this course for about 8 years in a row, where I put into practice this exact formula, so that I got participants to read. We read together, and I pushed them and pushed them and pushed them, and they got into raging arguments about a comma and about, you know, whether that capital E was actually justified or not in terms of whatever else was going on in the text. Like, you know, like scholars of sacred texts. And you remember that Freud indicates that our relation to the discourse produced by an analysand, a patient, should be the relation that a Torah scholar, for example, has with a text, insofar as they conceive of it as sacred. So a dream would be a sacred text. Well, I got my students for all of these years to treat short stories, poems, essays, whatever, novels, as sacred texts, and really take the trouble to get deeply into all kinds of details. And indeed, literally, meaning falls far, far behind. And one gets to a sort of raw plane of textuality, which is wonderful and incomprehensible at the same time. It's a bit like repeating one's own name tens of times until it becomes some weird sound. This is something that children do all the time, and I think it's quite interesting, and it's a parallel type of an experience. So, why am I saying all this? Because I think if one is taken by this reference, and one reads Paul de Man, and one reads why he considers that the discovery of meaning is really a form of what he calls misreading. Yeah. And there are many examples of this. Misreading is ideological reading. Misreading is normative reading. Misreading is therapeutic reading. Misreading is commonsensical reading. Misreading is a particular form of exercising power over the meaning of certain socially important texts. Meaning is the tyranny of the social against the singular, subjective construction of one's own sense of what might be going on in particular texts, in the text of one's life, for example. If one is curious, and I enthusiastically invite you to be curious about this possibility of understanding Freudian listening in terms of de Man's reading, then we have an answer regarding this mysterious characterization of evening hovering attention. And this answer, I think, can be a sort of a beacon for one's listening in the high seas of analytic sessions. And that is one looks towards the tane of the discursivity being produced live as we listen by the analysand. So one reads the illegible. And here one gets back to a formulation which is a bit Zen-like and a bit like clapping with a single hand. But now there's a very concrete content to this. One reads in the direction of the illegible. So the injunction that the analyst should not understand, is not an injunction to be silly or stupid or ignorant. It's a very powerful and very far-reaching indication to do with listening to the inarticulable, which is of course related to Lacan's notion of the real, which again is not a metaphor. And if I may, and this is a parting present, and I've done this a few times before in Mexico, and it's always very fascinating. I would propose that this reading workshop, reading the illegible, making layers of meaning fall behind like Canadian autumn leaves off the trees of textuality, this workshop described by the man is a wonderful training ground for analytic listening. So that if traditionally analytic listening is something which is matured in one's own analysis, and it's one of the important reasons why any analyst has to be previously analyzed, I think one can take recourse to this supplementary training in literature and work with language and work with this illegibility under the form of this very concrete and simple model from the 1950s that de Man describes. And therefore understand in very concrete and practical terms what it means to read the unreadable, and therefore eventually during sessions in analysis to listen to the inaudible. And that this strange, enigmatic form of listening that Freud is talking about, which sounds rather passive, is actually a very active gesture oriented by the desire of the analyst to keep track, to observe, to situate precisely that point in the discursivity of the analyst and where meanings fall behind, as I've described, and that this would be an active, sort of tuned form of directing analytic attention on the part of the analyst in order to keep to this very rigorous place of the place of residue, which is beyond the formations of subjectivity and beyond signifiers, and therefore situated at that very point which causes the formation of signifiers and the formation of the figures of subjectivity in any way that analysans may want to proceed along their labor of sculpting the signifiers that they live by. Okay, that's it. Of course.
Yeah, because we started a little late, so it's okay.
You have a question? Thank you very, very much, Benjamin. I very much enjoyed your talk. I just wanted to make a little small vignette of my own, because I think the things that I noticed at the start of this meeting, when the people that were introduced who were at this meeting, it wasn't mentioned that there might be physicians here, or it wasn't mentioned that there might be psychiatrists here. And I think that that's an important kind of tragedy that's going on, that's comparable to the thing that you're describing about capitalism and the different discourses that are taking on, perhaps the medicalization of society in keeping with the trafficking, in a sense, in a different kind of way. But just a little vignette I wanted to give you was just to disagree with something you said just slightly. When I was I think, second-year medical student, the clinician that I was working with said to me, as we were at the bedside of a patient, said, if you ever think, ever, that you know what you're doing, then you're going to be practicing fakery. So to the contrast what you said, that you will be a faker if you don't know what you're doing, he was saying the very opposite. And he said, you don't need to make a diagnosis. Stop trying to make a diagnosis. Listen to the patient. The patient will tell you what the diagnosis is. Mm-hmm. And remember, when you asked me the question, well, some things are physical and some are psychological, he said there is no difference. The patient will tell you what the diagnosis is. So in separating medicine from analysis, which took place at some point in the late 20s or 30s, and there's only few physicians now that seem to be interested in analysis, and analysts themselves don't seem to be interested in physicians. There's a divide going on there, which I think is a very kind of tragic thing that's happening. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to make that comment.
No, that's very, very welcome. And you made me think of something. First, the massive presence of subjectivity in medical practice. And I think psychoanalysis has learned a very, very great deal about transference and about all sorts of things going on the subjective plane on account of the presence of subjectivity in medical practice. And I fear that my description might have been even a bit unfair in relation to medicine by trying to contrast the position and sort of elucidate what I'm trying to get at on the psychoanalytic side of things. But you reminded me of something I wanted to mention, and it escaped my mind. When you say the patient themselves will lead you, the man says something very, very important, I think, for us, which is, and this is a distinctive trace of his work. He says, texts deconstruct themselves. It is not something that this reading that I'm trying to invite you to practice is not something that one does to a text. One simply observes how the literary textuality, the discursivity of an analysand analyzes itself. And I'm not saying the patient, I'm saying the patient's discourse. So I think one alternative account of what I've been trying to describe is precisely that one is there to testify and to, put a few sort of signals here and there, punctuations, a little push at some point, etc., in order for this unraveling of the analysand's own discourse to take place, and therefore to find the possibility of its own self-deconstruction, which is analysis. Yeah.
There's some people ahead of you, Hilda. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to pass it over to Wayne and over there as well. Okay. Yeah. So and then Wayne and then Steve and then Hilda. I really liked the Paul de Man reading that you gave us today, and it was good to go back to that. But of course, I mean, you know very well from the debates about the question of close reading and so on. That I mean, I was thinking about this last week when we read Lacan in our salon, and that we really go back and forth between a very close, we spend an hour on one paragraph or something, right? But then also on to go from the intrinsic to the extrinsic, where you bring in the social or the historical or the political, right? Because in the 50s in the U.S., that kind of close reading that was very hegemonic. It wasn't just a few people doing it. That's when Derrida was actually in the U.S. in the 50s as well. And there's a way in which that close reading, as much as I really agree with you, the notion of listening and listening for the inaudible and that, but it can be an apolitical kind of, a really arid kind of formalism that refuses the political in that. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, that's a big one, isn't it? I mean, the relation between psychoanalysis and politics in the end. Let me be brutal about this and say that psychoanalysis would be situated not on the register of politics, but of the political, and therefore of the creation of the conditions of possibility for the polis to constitute itself. Those who live outside of politics, par excellence, are psychotics. And that outside is, of course, politically charged in many, many ways. But psychosis would be the impossibility of polis. And the analyst situated in the position at the point of the tane of this mirror would be situated at the point where the production of the political is made possible. So we're talking about a political a priori, and I mean there's like many, many things about this that one could say, but that is why I find quite fortunate Lacan's affirmation that psychoanalysis is an ethics, not a moral, but an ethics insofar as it makes possible the production of signifiers and therefore of names and therefore of experience, etc. But I would move in the direction of sort of situating politics as an effect and suggesting how the analyst works at the level of the cause of that effect, and then takes things on from there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very moving and very profound remarks here. I'm sure you know that I'd just like to mention a few things before I get to my question. The first is the book called The Taint of the Mirror by Rodolphe Gachet, that's also right on this topic and certainly very relevant here. And the second is the relation between your description of listening to what Heidegger calls Gelassenheit, letting beings be, a kind of phenomenological listening that attends to the emergent and tries to hold back prejudice, presupposition, expectation in order for the emergent to emerge more fully. So these references, I think, can easily be tied in here. At the same time, as your description I found very, very convincing and very moving, I also found it very troubling because of a dynamic that I'm sure you'll recognize when I describe it to you in a minute, and that is, the role of discipline in both the speaker who wants to know and the speaker who doesn't want to know. At a certain point, I have this from my own teaching experience. The more I try to convince my students that actually no, they really don't know, the more they want to know, and the more I'm in the position of insisting, no, they really don't know. And so there's a moment of disciplining oneself and the other in terms of the limit of the knower, the limit of the knowledge, that becomes itself a kind of dogmatism in a way, right? The dogmatism of unknowing versus the dogmatism of knowing. And it seems to me that, especially with the little a, this remarkable substances you described that are dynamic as you could imagine it, it would tend to unsettle both positions, it would seem to me, and would lead you necessarily to a kind of, for me, this is the meaning of the hovering, which is so brilliant in Freud's description, a permanent suspension, a permanent ambiguity between and across the knowing and the unknowing that drives the investigation further. So it seems to me, at some point, one will be forced into this ambiguous position where this tension needs to be preserved. I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Yeah, I really appreciate all of your comments. And basically, I would point in two directions. The first is to say that there is no guarantee that what I'm calling therapeutic discourse is only psychotherapies or, to come back to this earlier point, sort of non-Lacanian psychoanalysis, and that I'm here like invoking the dogmatic position that, this is the real stuff and everything else is just therapy. Nope. That dogmatism that you're describing is very observable amongst Lacanian psychoanalysts also. And very clearly, and I think this is exactly where Hilda yesterday pointed out, the risk that this sort of modelic work around the four discourses can take on the quality of a new sort of master discursive function. It is perfectly possible that oneself, in the first place, behave as a therapist by rigidly keeping to one's own understanding of Lacan or of psychoanalysis. So I think what I'm trying to get at here is equally relevant for all of us regarding of where we might stand in relation to all these various implicit or explicit positions. That's the first point. The second point is that, and I couldn't go into this now, I did only very partially during the first day. I'm trying to describe these two other discourses I've called the discourse of subjectivity producing deconstruction and institutionalizing, institution producing deconstruction, which would be the second one, as instances in which knowledge is sort of eroded by this peculiar jouissance substance, the little a. I think, in fact, to perhaps be a bit clear on this in shorthand, psychoanalysis is tremendously important to Derridian deconstruction, to the point that, in fact, I understand there are more references to Freud than to Heidegger in his work, and he's considered a sort of a Heideggerian philosopher, so-called philosopher. So when he interrogates psychoanalysis, and he does so at various places, importantly, I think what he's interrogating is psychoanalysis turned into therapy. Psychoanalysis turned into a knowledge. And the operation would be precisely to, and here I'm tempted, I don't know the English word for this. In Spanish, we talk about a soplete, which is this apparatus which produces a very powerful flame that is used to melt down sort of various things when you install tubes and water tubes at home. Do you know what that's called in English? Welding torch. It's not the welding torch as such, which is flame torch. I don't know, perhaps I'm just, but I have this image of this flame torch. The small a is a flame, like a very powerful flame torch, which burns through any instance of S2, of knowledge. And this, I think, accounts for a counter-dogmatism which I would want to make us more aware of, which, and this is, I think, the extraordinary thing, can be, and this is a paradox, or at least it sounds like a paradox, it can be instituted. And in a conversation with Hilda, she said, well, I'm like looking for the various forms in which one might conceive of the Lacan salon itself as something which keeps away from any hardening up of positions. Yeah. And I think, this is a problem that I've faced at the institute that I work in. And the whole point is perhaps to map out the social bond that articulates that institutional project precisely as one of these, both of these social links, which are in a peculiar relation with each other, like it's undecidable when one is keeping to one and when one is keeping to the other. But in any case, as far as psychoanalysis is concerned, and the dogmatism in psychoanalysis, or in therapy. I think we might conceive of this critical relation, this radical critique that comes from deconstructive discursivity, with this fire torch, directed at knowledge, when that knowledge becomes directive of whatever it is going on in or outside a psychoanalytic session. Thanks for your points, very, very valuable.
Is it on? Okay.
Yep.
I was wondering if you could briefly elaborate on the technical relation between listening, scansion, and the quilting point.
Yeah. That's a very interesting thing to experiment with this reading workshop setup. Where would one establish scansion in reading a text? It exists also. You know, the punchline, or, you know, the conclusion of a reading or an interpretation, etc. We were talking about this also in relation to cinema and editing, the editing table and the cut and scansion, and there's like a very, very rich set of questions that opens up at that point. My very straightforward response, it is a bit sort of jargon-laden, but it'll have to do to be fast about it. I distinguish between the S1 produced in analysis from the S1, the theological S1, which is the agent in the discourse of the master. And I said, with a little help from Heidegger and Derrida, that S1 is a philosopheme, is a metaphysically laden signifier. It's a theological signifier. Whereas this signifier, produced by analytic discourse, is not. That signifier is the signifier that occupies the place in Derridian terms of a quasi-transcendental. So, for example, the very names difference, parergon, all these names that Derrida privileges at a certain point because of the structural position that they occupy in relation to a discursive movement created by his readings and by deconstruction as such, which, again, would be suggested by texts themselves. They wouldn't be chosen as a very deliberate gesture on the part of the reader or the listener. They would be produced by way of an event, by the very discursive tissue of the discourse of the analyst and in free association. That signifier which is attached to this quasi-transcendental position, when that emerges, that's the point of scansion. And I have thought about this for a number of years in my practice, and I am quite convinced that that's a way of describing when scansion is paradigmatically appropriate. Now, of course, we're dealing permanently with the exceptions and the singular, and therefore one has to work around each time. One has to wade through the session with the uncertainty that we were just mentioning in the previous question. But that would be, for me, the sort of honest answer that I can give. And I think one can put that to the test in a reading workshop, which has the advantage of not sort of doing this onto a patient when one is learning still, and it's better to mess up with the text than with an analyst and right.
I just want to make two quick comments and just a question. When you are talking about the way the analysts listen, I just want to point out that that has a cost for the analyst in the sense of erasing his or her own subjectivity, and in change, she or he is giving nothing, right? And I just want to kind of relate that with the cost of the session, right? You are charging the analyst for giving him nothing, right? And that cost, because, yeah, no one gives you nothing the same way, right? Also, I wanted to point out about the political that Clint was asking. For me, the very act of kind of that erasing your narcissism, your knowledge, I think it's in a way political because it kind of puts you out of the exercise of power. But I understand that you were more asking about the politics, but I just want to mention that. And the question is, I think you mentioned a little bit in this institutional thing, what was your proposal about when to take out of the consulting room the analysis?
Right, yeah. You spare another hour, please? Yeah, thank you. I liked your formulation, charging for nothing. And what I've tried to do is to make that nothing, describe it in terms of the enormous activity it actually entails. You described it in terms of subjective cost. Yeah, because sometimes one feels like saying, oh, come on, you're just saying such a lot of bullshit now that this is, just don't waste your time on this. Or, that's fascinating, who told you this? And there is a sort of Zen aspect to this about the training of the analyst and the differentiation between one's subjectivity and one's function, one's role as the analyst occupying that place. And yes, that costs, and therefore it's one of the many reasons why the session has to cost. Most of them, I think, have to do with the patient himself or herself. The need to neutralize debt, transferential debt towards the figure of the analyst, and therefore pay in order for this debt not to accumulate under the form of love or indebtedness, moral debt, which is awful. And of course the cost of the session has to be, I think, defined on that basis. And also on the basis how much of an effort does it entail for the analyst to keep to the analytic position. Some cases one finds more difficult than others, and I think it's important for the analyst not to feel that a debt is created because they've got to put up with stuff that they find really hard, and so there's a very complex thing. One could talk for a long time about psychoanalysis and money. Now, to go straight to the outside of the consulting office question, I think it's quite clear that since it's a discourse, that since psychoanalysis here I've been talking about as a discourse and not some kind of a peculiar practice, and taking into account what I began mentioning regarding how discursivity is no less individual than it is social and vice versa, then in principle there is nothing that ties analytic discourse to a particular setup. And this, rather than mentioning very concrete other setups that this discourse can be expressed in, I basically want to leave as an open invitation for you to think what other scenes analytic discourse might take place in beyond the analytic consulting room. However, in order not to give you the feeling that I'm just loading you with the work, I want to give two examples. I wonder whether I can get internet going here. I tried a while ago and it didn't completely work. In order to give you one of my examples. Let me see if I can get this going. Yeah, it's thinking. I'll start with the other example. At the Institute, we had a young analyst who... Thanks. Very good. And she had done our 2 years of critical theory and psychoanalysis in her studies, and she got to the point when she had to produce a final project, which we have happen over one single semester with a preparation of another semester before. And she came and lived in Villahermosa, Tabasco, which is this Mexican state on the Gulf, which was 80% of it was underwater with these terrible floods, something comparable to New Orleans and all of that. But the whole 80% of the entire state was underwater. And she was like trying to do her work at home while all of this was going on. Her house was not affected, but of course she knew loads of people who were going through all kinds of trouble. And as you can imagine, her readings rapidly began to lose any sense at all in relation to, what was actually going on. So she had the strength to assume that, in fact, it made absolutely no sense to continue working on what she'd prepared the previous semester, and that she really had to get involved in what was going on for all kinds of reasons. So the first thing she did was she put on her green sort of robe, what she'd been taught to use as a psychologist. She'd done a degree in psychology. So she went out to offer her services to anyone who might be in need of them. And she quickly found out it was completely useless to do this. She had this idea of putting up this tent and having people talk about how they were feeling, kind of thing, which is a funny character of a therapeutic gesture. And it just didn't make any sense at all. So eventually, she started just talking to people, and people started telling their own tales. And she put together a collection of testimonies of what had gone on that slowly became clear as she went along. In fact, performed a very, very fundamental function, because people talked about what they had lost and who had died and what had got on, and like the difficulty they had. The state of Tabasco denied there was a single casualty, which is like ridiculous. But the effect of this on the population was really very grave, because there was this like tragedy going on, and there was no acknowledgement on the side of official discourse that any of this was as terrible as it felt on the ground. So, in order to cut a long story short, what she ended up putting together, in fact, was something that brought together the residual and directed it critically towards the, let us say, the subject or the knowledge that the state was putting out on parade. The subjectivity, the official subjectivity, that one might even say the political subjectivity. And here you see it's a social dimension that's going on. It's a very different scenario from the actual clinical office. And it allowed to reorganize the account of the entire experience, putting in the place of truth all the versions coming out of the state, which were like useless in terms of how people might be able to relate more directly with what they were living. And I think that would be an example of how textual production, which is circulated in public, and she has had this like incredible acclaim, and people really, really found her work engaging and important. She got immediately offers to publish it and to present it, and so on and so forth. And I think this might be described perhaps as an analytic intervention in the social dimension. The other example I want to very briefly mention is something I've been involved in for over 15 years, I'm afraid, which is blind people's photography, which again have a very wonderful critical effect on the photographic apparatus, dispositif as such, insofar as it brings back blindness, the residual, par excellence, of the world of the image, and sort of interpolates, let us say, photographic subjectivity, putting in the place of truth all the commonsensical rubbish that goes on about how the blind have no relation with the image, and so on and so forth. I mean, what do you mean? These guys can cross streets and they know what a red light is and what a green light is, and they know what the photo of their children is, or their parents, even if they're blind from birth. So this project has been very, very stimulating and a lot of fun to do, because of course it completely puts in a crisis all the usual understandings about what image production is about and who's actually able to produce images. And again, I think this working with the residue of blindness and having blindness expressed under the form of images, etc., would perhaps be a way of thinking of an analytic intervention which is taking place in an aesthetic domain with massive consequences for all kinds of things, consequences that have to do with a whole range of the contexts in which images and sight are important, and there are many, many instances of that today due to the massive growth of the presence of photography and of the image in general. And that, to me, which is also a model, an institutional model of operation, the blind photographer, in fact, modeled the Institute of Critical Studies that I work at. Topologically, it was taken by us as a suggestion of what a critical studies institute might be like, might be about today. And I would dare say that that topology figures analytic discourse as such, and would be perhaps a second example of analytic discourse in the act and beyond the psychoanalytic consulting room. Okay, you've been very, very patient. I thank you very, very much for everything.